What's going on, guys? Phil here from Custom Offices. I got Brad with me because Brad refuses to make an additional video because the last time we made a shock comparison video, people got really angry because you had a mint in your mouth and it just, wasn't good. The shocking truth, if you want to look at it, reflect on the old days. So I pulled out a whole bunch of these and I'm just going to ask you silly questions about all the shocks so we can explain some of the differences between all the different versions, because when people are buying lift kits, they want to know, what's the deal with Bilstein, Rough Country, Fox, King? What am I paying for? What am I getting? So, what are the differences between these four?
These four shocks are all going to be pretty similar. They're all going to be a monotube shock with about a 2-inch diameter body. There's going to be slight variations. I think the Bilstein's actually a little smaller, so the piston's going to be a little smaller in the Bilstein. The shock shaft's a little smaller in the Bilstein as well. But these are pretty much all in the same field. These two, the Fox and the Rough Country V2 here, are going to have an aluminum body, and then these two are going to have a steel body. This one's kind of got like a turned steel body, and then they, I think, like zinc coat this one or something like that, where this one's powder coated steel body. But they're all pretty similar, nitrogen charged, fixed valving.
So that's when people hear a gas shock or nitrogen shock or nitro shock, it's all the same thing.
Yeah, a gas charged shock is a nitrogen charged shock. That's the gas that they use to charge a shock.
So then what's the difference then between the steel body and aluminum body? What are the pros and cons of each one? Obviously aluminum's lighter weight, but does it really matter?
The advantage of aluminum is going to be the weight savings and the ability to dissipate heat better than steel. Steel is obviously cheaper, so steel shocks are going to be cheaper to manufacture, and then therefore going to be a little bit cheaper to purchase usually. So all the high-end stuff is going to be aluminum body in a sense, and you'll see when we get down here they're actually not aluminum, depending on if it's a threaded body. A lot of them use steel and blah blah blah, but the advantage of aluminum is lightweight and heat dissipation, and it doesn't rust. It does corrode, but it won't rust like a steel body.
Well, and then, so like, this is the Rough Country N3, and now this is the Rough Country V2 monotube. Both from Rough Country. What should you pick if you have a lifted truck?
Which one you should pick? It's kind of hard to say. It depends, I guess, what you're after. Obviously, the V2 is going to be the more expensive option, but it is a nicer option, in my opinion. It's the aluminum body, which we talked about. It's a lot lighter. You can feel actually the difference. And the components and the materials that they use on the V2 shock are just going to be nicer, and therefore it demands a nicer or higher price tag because of it. They have a nicer seal in them and stuff like that, and the valving and the piston and seals inside are going to be a little bit higher quality as well, and same with even the bushing ends. It's just a nicer built shock, and it's going to perform a little bit better for you as well. So I mean, this is a nicer shock, but is it necessarily going to be better for you? It depends on what you're after. If you're just after strictly value, then I'd say no. But if you're looking for more performance, then yes, definitely.
So, and I guess like performance is one of those things that gets weird because some people think a stiffer ride is going to be better performing, but some people that daily drive their trucks and they only drive them on the street, they don't necessarily want that stiffer ride. And we'll get into that probably more when we touch on the coilovers, but I guess that's something to keep in mind too, is like, is one of these going to be stiffer than the other? I think the V2 probably is going to give you better ride quality.
They're going to have different valving, and it gets really complicated because of the valving and shim stacks and everything like that, how they have them set up, and like there's digressive valving and everything like that. So like a higher frequency will actually maybe equate to a softer dampening rather than a slower frequency, depending on the kind of valving that the shocks have. So I mean, the V2 is probably going to give you a more performance-oriented, firmer feel, whereas an N3 or some shock like that, a standard shock, is probably going to be a little more, I guess you would say, conservative and less aggressive, maybe a little softer ride, if you want to call it that.
I guess from there then we'll jump to the reservoir shock, and this is actually for the rear of a vehicle, but like Rough Country makes reservoirs too. This example is just from King. So when you step up to this, I think people start to see this and they're like, yeah, that's sweet, I want one of those. But again, I guess what are the big advantages of going with a remote reservoir? Or I guess, would you not call this remote reservoir because it's still attached?
This
It's
is
just a regular
this
resi?
This is a remote reservoir. Wait, they call this a piggyback reservoir because it's still physically, I guess, connected to the body of the shock here. They call it a piggyback as opposed to a remote reservoir, which is usually connected by a hose and you can move it kind of wherever you want it. Whereas this is fixed, the reservoir here kind of stays there. The advantage of the reservoir is not only does it look cool, that's what everyone thinks about them.
Falling for the gram.
And they want it because of the cool look, and they know that race cars use reservoir shocks, and that's cool. And it is cool, but really the reason for the reservoir is inside of here you have your shock shaft, and there's going to be a piston on the shaft with your shims on it, your valving, and then there's also going to be another piston, which would be the floating piston, which separates the nitrogen gas from the hydraulic fluid. And with the reservoir shock, that's actually, they move that into the reservoir. So on these shocks here, these are called an emulsion shock because everything is emulsified together. So all that's in the same body. So that floating piston's in here, everything's in here. On a reservoir shock, you can move that floating piston to the reservoir. So it gives you basically a more compact body, so you can get more travel out of the same length body because there's less parts in there. You move it over to the reservoir, and you have more fluid, so you can dissipate heat better. So those are some of the advantages of it. It's not necessarily, like a reservoir shock isn't necessarily going to ride differently. You can valve an emulsion, King 2.5 and a reservoir King 2 or 2.5 the same, and they should ride pretty much the same. The benefits are going to be the heat dissipation and then also the physical size characteristics.
I think in the names of shocks too, people like a 2.5. We're talking about the body diameter here, whereas this is a 2-inch. It's talking about this body diameter. Actually, these are all 2 inches.
Yeah, and what that matters to you is obviously the larger the diameter of the body, the larger the piston is inside of the shock. The larger the piston is, the more dampening ability that piston has because it has a larger surface area that it can dampen fluid, or there's more fluid that'll run through it, therefore it has more dampening ability versus a smaller piston.
And that's like what's happening inside the shock when this actually is compressing, which hopefully we'll be able to find a graphic or something that shows how that works. And then jumping to the coilovers, this is obviously gonna be like the more expensive or most expensive option. And now it's not just a shock. You kind of have a shock and a spring.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of a misconception because this is a shock. These are both, this King 2.5 is just this King 2.5 shock, except it has a coil spring around the body is all it really is. It's just a more compact and efficient way to package a spring and a shock is what a coilover is. Coilovers usually offer adjustability on the spring preload that you can have here. You'll see it's threaded up here and there's this collar. So you can actually turn that collar and you can actually adjust the preload on the spring. You can apply more preload, take more preload off.
What is preload?
Preload is basically, if you have a freestanding spring, you'd have zero preload on it if you just had this barely touching or zero lash. If you start to tighten basically the collar down on the spring, you're compressing the spring. So that spring is preloaded, meaning it already has a force applied to it in its given state. So it'll basically stiffen the spring if you want to think of it that way. And it'll like lift your truck up a little bit. The more you preload it, the more it stiffens the spring and it'll kind of lift the truck up for you.
And then, so this is for an 8-inch GM 1500. This is a 7.5-inch GM 1500, but the Rough Country Vertex one is actually longer. But then like some of the difference I noticed is just looking at it, this spring doesn't seem to be quite as thick, and then this has a lot more like travel, pretty much. Got a lot of more shaft there.
Yeah, I didn't really look at that. I actually didn't even know what the two of these are for, but yeah, it looks like, just looking at the diameter of the coil spring, it looks like the King here has a heavier spring on it. This is a softer spring, so this is, when you install it, this setup's gonna compress more just with the weight of the vehicle than this King will. So it's all how they have it set up, so it's hard to judge, the length of, the overall length doesn't necessarily equate to much because there's a lot of variables involved with the spring and whatnot.
And then one other major difference between these two is the adjustability. So on top of the Rough Country one, you've got the dial from 1 to 10, and then the Kings don't have any adjustability. But then like Fox also has its DSC, right?
Yeah,
Their adjustable
Fox,
coilovers.
Yeah, so pretty much all the manufacturers have, this is going to be up here. This is what people like here. This is a dampening adjustment for the valving of the shock, and you can adjust it on the fly here with this little knob. This is our only example on this table that has this adjustable option. King, Fox, they all have one, but as you can see here, this particular one that we have here is fixed valving. So the valving is all on the shim stack on the piston inside the shock, and it's kind of set. You can change it if you take the shock apart, and it's labor intensive, but it doesn't have on-the-fly adjustment like this Vertex does, which is nice because you can change the damping characteristics with the turn of a knob.
Which is really nice.
Which is nice.
You set it at 1 and it drives really smooth, and 10
for the most part,
nice
people
off-road setup.
dial it to 1 and they leave it there.
Okay, so now rearranged in order of price, kind of from cheapest to most expensive down the line. With the Rough Country Vertex ones are like $2,100 for the coilovers, and you jump up to Kings and it's $3,900 for that kit. So why do things cost so much different, Brad?
I mean, it's probably like anything else in the world. It all has to do with the brand and the manufacturing costs pretty much associated with it. So obviously if something is cheaper to manufacture, generally it'll have a cheaper price tag. So there's a lot of that involved. Some of it has to do with, I guess, the brand that you're paying for and whatnot.
There's performance, and there's also like heritage. If King's just been around for a long time, everybody knows the name, and everybody knows that they're probably some of the best shocks and coilovers.
Yeah, and when it comes to shocks, a lot of what you get out of a shock is stuff you can't see, you know, what the internals of a shock. So one shock, like a King, may have very expensive components inside and therefore have a really expensive price tag, but it's almost the same as, you know, a Vertex or whatnot on the outside. So there's a lot that can't be seen as well that has to do with pricing.
So that's some of the differences on the shocks. Obviously, we have the lift kits that go along with all this on the website, customoffices.com. Brad's kind of our shock and suspension guru. I just get to play them on camera and ask him lots of questions, right?
Yes, that happens.
Good. Peace.